Life tables provide the most accurate and detailed way to understand what's going to happen to a population from generation to generation. But it's not always practical or possible to get the kind of data that you need to make a life table. And so we often rely on simpler models that can still tell us about what's going to happen to a population. So we'll take a look at per capita growth rates and how those are used to understand exponential growth and logistic growth. So a per capita growth rate lets us look at the change in population size over any time period. It doesn't track the age classes. It doesn't track who had the babies. It really just looks at how many births were in a population over a certain time period and how many deaths there were. And that time period could be a year, it could be 2 years, it could be 10 years. It can be really any time period that's relevant to the organism or the research question. And so let's look at this example. This is imagining a deer population in a certain time period where we saw 100 births over that time period. And so for that population, we would say that there was 100 births out of 1,000 deer. So that's 100 divided by 1,000. And that gives you a value of 0.1. And that would be equal to the birth rate. In that same time period, in that same population, there were 50 deaths out of 1,000 deer. And so that's equal to 0.05, and that would be the death rate. And so the per capita growth rate, which is represented with a small r, is equal to the birth rate. So there's the birth rate minus the death rate. So taking the births minus the deaths. So we subtract the birth rate minus the death rate. And in this case, those values are 0.1 minus 0.05. And so the per capita growth rate for this deer population is 0.05. So to predict the future deer population, I can think about the change first of all. So the change in the population is equal to the value, the original population size, which is n, times the per capita growth rate. So in this example, there was 1,000 deer, and the per capita growth rate is 0.05. So the change in the population is positive 50. So that means that it will grow by 50. So the new population is equal to the original population size plus the change. So in this case, 1,000 plus 50, which would be 1,050. So that's written in an equation form here. The future population size is equal to the current population size, n, plus n times r. So this deer population would be 1,050 in the future. So we can make general predictions based on R, like we did with the net reproductive rate. In this case, the per capita growth rate was 0.05, so it's a positive value. So if R is greater than 0, again, which we could say is positive, then the population size is growing. If R is less than 0, that is, if it's a negative value, that means the death rate is bigger than the birth rate. That's how you would get a negative value. And so the population size is getting smaller. There's more deaths than births. If R is equal to 0, because it's the birth rate minus the death rate, if that comes out to be 0, that means there's equal numbers of births and deaths. So the population is staying the same. Okay. So shorthand is if it's positive, the population is growing. If it's negative, the population is getting smaller. If it's 0, then the population is staying the same. So in a population where R is positive, that is, it's greater than 0, then the population is increasing rapidly. So if you were to graph the population size over number of generations, you would see what's called a J-shaped curve. So again, this is the population, the number of individuals, and the generations or time across the x-axis. We see this rapid increase. So it's like growing even faster. So if R is equal to 1.0, that J is sharper. If R is smaller, it's still going up very rapidly, but the J is slightly more of a curved J, if you will, less straight. So one of the things that happens with exponential growth is that as n gets bigger, excuse me, the faster it grows. So basically, and this gets into a little bit of math, when you have a curve like this, so imagine a point in time right here. Well, let me do two. So if we have a dot here and a dot here, okay, the actual rate of change is imagining a line from there. So on this dot, the rate of change is relatively slow, like, because if I drew a line there, it's not that steep of a line. But if I were to draw a line to imagine the rate of change here, a straight line, that would be a much more steep line. And if I compared this line to this line, it's changed. So this line was relatively flat. This line is relatively sharp. So it means along this J-shaped curve, the rate of change is changing. And if you haven't learned about this in math, you probably will at some point, right? So this is compared to, say, just a straight line like this. This has the same rate of change across the line. So no matter where you are on a linear relationship, the line that at those dots is exactly the same rate of change. So when you see exponential growth, what it's saying is that it's changing. The bigger it gets, the faster it changes. Okay, so that's another way to say it. The bigger that it gets, the faster it changes. Whereas if the line looked like this, it wouldn't matter. No matter how big it got, it was always changing at the same rate. Okay, so why is this important? Well, because it tells you that the growth gets faster. Okay, the growth is getting faster. And that's really important to know if you're trying to predict population size. So exponential growth is actually relatively rare in nature. So there's certain circumstances that will occur where you will at least temporarily see exponential growth, but then that exponential growth will stop. And so in nature, organisms just can't reproduce infinitely without consequences, because remember that organisms are limited by resources. And so eventually there's a resource limitation to growth. So offspring no longer will survive because there's not enough food, for example. And so again, in nature, even if you temporarily have exponential growth, it will shift because this is unsustainable. So So to take a closer look at this, right, in nature, we can sometimes have exponential growth when, for example, we have reintroduction of a population. So that's what this is an example of. The Tule elk was reintroduced to an environment where it had gone extinct. And for a period of time, the population went through exponential growth. And same thing here with the black-footed ferrets in this area. They were reintroduced to this area and they went through a period of exponential growth. So when organisms are reintroduced, at first there was no competition because there weren't any of them there, right? And so as their population grows into that space, you would expect that as it approaches the top here, so as you get more and more of them, competition will increase. And so as competition increases, the ability of this population to continue to exponentially grow will be limited. Okay, so again, this is driven by the fact that there's only so many resources in the environment. And so what you see is that organisms will actually experience logistic growth. So I'm circling here the areas of logistic growth. So at some point for most species, resources become limiting as populations grow. So they might have experienced exponential growth for a while, but now they're going to go into this period where they're actually limited by something called the carrying capacity, which is represented here as K. So carrying capacity is the maximum population size that the resources in the environment can support. So this is sometimes called the S-shaped curve because you at first might see this exponential growth, but then it turns and makes almost like an S shape. Okay. And so in nature, what you might see if you were to measure or track a stable population, so one that hasn't been reintroduced, is you might see a population kind of doing something like this. So this would be population size. This is time. And so you see populations fluctuating a little bit, but they're approximately hovering around their carrying capacity. And so this would be good evidence of logistic growth. They're resource limited and they're existing approximately stably around their carrying capacity. This sometimes gets confusing to people because you don't see the S part, like you don't see this part. But remember, this part is triggered by, for example, reintroduction. A population in the wild where resources are relatively stable wouldn't necessarily be going through a period of time in which they went through rapid growth. This is an experimental demonstration in a test tube type environment. Okay, but again, if I were just to start studying a stable deer population today, I would be more likely to see it just hovering around its carrying capacity. So what factors influence population size? We've been focusing for now on density-dependent mortality factors. These are mortality factors whose influence varies with the density of the population. So that is how much they cause organisms to die is increased by there being more organisms, right? So the more organisms there are, the more likely they are to die from a density-dependent mortality factor. So these include a lot of species interactions like parasitism. So these are like infections, predation, being eaten by something, and competition, and that's resource availability. So that's what I was focusing on a few moments before. So for example, predators will oftentimes kill less prey when the prey population is low, and they're able to kill more prey when the population is higher. So predators are usually a density-dependent mortality factor. Density-independent mortality factors are ones that's effect is random, and they're not affected by population size. So something like a flood, for example, or a fire, these just sweep through and kill who's ever there, right? The fire isn't worse. It doesn't kill a larger percentage of the population just because there's more of a population. It's just like whoever was there got killed, okay? So when we're thinking about carrying capacity is driven by density-dependent factors because we're saying that it's a value that's reached when the population size reaches a certain point, okay? But there are density-independent factors as well. And these can come in and change your population as well. So when you're using real data, right, so when you're looking at a real deer population, you have to consider that both types of factors might be happening as you track that population. So some generalizations that we can make about populations and how they grow, how they reproduce, their survivorship, their competitive ability are called life history strategies. And we break them into two categories using these terms, per capita growth rate, or R, and carrying capacity, K. So some species are R-selected species, and remember, R stands for per capita growth. So these are species that have optimized growth rate. So they tend to have a high rate of per capita population growth. Whereas K-selected species have more or less stable populations around carrying capacity. So they tend to exist at carrying capacity. And so R-selected species have really high growth, but generally are not good competitors. Whereas K-selected species, again, they tend to have existed carrying capacity. So they're not rapid growers, like they're not going through exponential growth all the time. But they tend to be better competitors. That's what helps them exist at carrying capacity. Okay, so a low reproductive rate, but better competitors. So kind of classic example is R-selected species are things that we oftentimes consider weeds. So think about, like, for example, a dandelion. Dandelions can go from like 0 to 10,000 in a lawn very easily because they're very well adapted for a high growth rate, but they're not good competitors. So you tend to see dandelions take over when a lawn isn't in very good condition. So when the health of the grass is low. Whereas if the health of the grass is high, then you tend to not see that many dandelions in it. They can't compete with the grass as well. Trees are your typical K-selected species. Trees take a long time to reproduce. I mean, many trees don't even make seeds until they're 10 years old, for example. And then their seeds aren't generally that successful. So, like an oak tree might have less than one of its acorns become a baby tree. But it's really good at competition. So it can be sort of at the top of the forest, right, getting light and outcompeting lots of other organisms. So specific traits are associated with R-selected versus K-selected species. So a whole host of traits go along with this ability. So this is a list here. So if you look at R-selected species, they tend to go through rapid growth and development from seed to mature plant, or from baby to mature offspring very quickly. They have a high reproductive rate, so they have lots of offspring. They generally are sexually mature very early. They have a small body size, a short lifespan. They don't have very good competitive ability, as we were saying before. They're young. They tend to have a high mortality rate in the young, so that type 3 survivorship curve. Their population size is highly variable. It can be very high and then drop to very low and then go back to high and go very low. So it's going through these dramatic ups and downs. They disperse very well. So again, think like a dandelion is optimized for dispersal. They generally have very low parental care, and they tend to do really well in disturbed habitats. So, for example, in a field that's been torn up by, a tractor or, a bulldozer, that's going to be a place where you're going to see a lot of weeds. You're not going to see trees doing well in that area, but weeds will be just fine. K-selected species, on the other hand, tend to have slow development. It takes them a long time to reach maturity and grow. They tend to have few numbers of offspring. It takes them a long time to reach sexual maturity. They have larger body size, longer lifespans. They're good competitors. They tend to have either a type 2 or type 1 survivorship curve, so low mortality of the young. Their population sizes tends to be stable, so it tends to just oscillate a tiny bit around carrying capacity. They don't disperse as well. So like an acorn, for example, that's a heavy seed that just drops below the oak tree, and it has to rely on squirrels to move it compared to a dandelion. They tend to provide more parental care. Now, again, this is for organisms that provide parental care. So neither a tree nor a dandelion provides parental care. But if you look at animals, you'll tend to see more parental care. And then K-selected species tend to do better in undisturbed areas. So again, trees are really harmed by human disruption or other disruption, like a flood or a fire or something like that, whereas your R-selected species will generally recover more easily. So with all of that in mind, we can compare two mammals. Like this comparison is between plants, but if we looked at an elephant versus a mouse, which one is R-selected and which one is K-selected? An elephant is definitely a K-selected species. They have long lifespans. They're slow reproducers, large body size, long lifespans. They have lots of parental care. Their young don't die that much. And they do better when their habitat is not disturbed. Mice are much more of an R-selected species. They're sexually mature very quickly. They have lots of young. They reach sexual maturity very quickly. They're small, short lifespans. A lot of their young die. Their population size is much more variable, and they really are okay with disturbed habitats. So, you see mice doing well living in human disturbed spaces. Okay, so that's an animal example.